Has your mouth ever written a check that you couldn't cash? You know what I mean? Sometimes our mouth gets us in trouble. Make a promise and there's no way to really fulfill it. But let me talk to you real quick about what a promise really means. When you make a promise, because I don't think that we really think through all the aspects of a promise being made. When a promise is made, you obviously have the one making the promise to someone else, and the promise itself needs to be received by someone. And so one person makes a promise to another, the other person receives the promise, and we know what hopefully happens. The person who makes the promise fulfills the promise. That's what we're going to go with, that we would fulfill our promises. And so we think that that's pretty much it. Someone made a promise, someone else received it, the promise is fulfilled or not. But there's a fourth aspect of what happens when someone makes a promise. And the fourth thing that happens, or the fourth component of a promise being made, is that the receiver has to respond. There's always a response when a promise is fulfilled. Now, we don't usually think about that last part, but the last part is incredibly important. You see, every promise fulfilled requires a response. I'll give you an example. Have you ever had a car loan? A lot of us have had car loans. Have you ever paid off a car loan? Fewer of us have paid off the car loan. But nevertheless, if you pay off the car loan, what does the bank or the loan company send you for fulfilling your promise? They send you a title. They send you some type of receipt, right? And so you receive an electronic receipt. You receive a receipt in the mail that says, hey, you paid this off, and you get the title. There is a response to you keeping your promise. Now, we know that God makes promises. And we know that God keeps all the promises that he makes. That's not the issue. The issue is when God makes and fulfills a promise, how do we respond? We need to respond to what God has done. So way back in the book of Genesis, I invite you to take your Bible and turn to Genesis 21. We'll get to that chapter in just a minute. But let me sort of lay out the framework of what we're going to study today. Way back when Abraham was a mere 75 years old, God made a promise to him. And here's the promise. We read about it in Genesis 12. God said to Abraham, I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. This promise was made to Abraham when Abraham was 75 years old. A little while after that, God confirmed his promise to Abraham, and he clarified his promise, specified his promise just a little bit more. And we read about that in Genesis 15. It says, then, behold, the word of Yahweh, that's the Lord, came to him, saying, this one will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, now look toward the heavens and number the stars if you're able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your seed be. Well, at age 85, Abraham, as you can sort of tell from that verse, decided to help God out with keeping his promise. And it was Sarah's idea, and Abraham went along. And so he was going to help God out by having a child with Sarah, his wife's maidservant, Hagar. But I got news for you. God does not need your help keeping his promises. He's very capable of keeping his own promises without us interfering. So that happened at age 85. And then you fast forward to age 99. At age 99, again, God confirmed and even further specified or clarified his promise to Abraham, and Abraham is now known by that name, Abraham, instead of Abram. God gave Abraham a new name, meaning father of a multitude. That's an audacious claim for God to make. That God would give a 99-year-old, basically childless man, that he would be a father of a multitude. But that's what God did. God called him Abraham, called him father of a multitude. And at age 99, God said to Abraham these words in Genesis 17. As for Sarai, your wife, I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. My covenant I will establish with Isaac, through whom Sarah will bear to you at this season next year. God changed Sarai's name to Sarah as well. And so God made a promise to Abraham at age 99 that in a year's time, he's going to have a child, a male heir, by or through Sarah. By the time that God fulfilled his promise, by the time Abraham is 100 years old and the child comes on the scene, which is what we're about to read, Abraham had been waiting for God to fulfill his promise for 25 years. For a quarter of a century, God had been promising, and nothing had been happening yet. Let me ask you, have you ever grown impatient with God? Have you ever doubted God's character because you thought that he was slow in keeping his promise to you? Have you ever believed that maybe God forgot all about me? Hello, God. Little old me. I'm down here. Have you forgotten? Maybe you've been praying for a loved one to get right with God, and it hasn't happened yet. It's taking a long time. Or maybe there's some provision that you need in life that God hasn't given you yet. And you're wondering, where's this provision? Where's the answer to my prayer? I want you to know something. God has not forgotten you. God is not in a hurry. You and I might be in a hurry. God's not. God will fulfill his promises in his perfect timing. What you're called to do today is trust. Trust him. Well, in the chapter that we're going to begin reading in Genesis 21, there are two episodes that we'll look at today. And God fulfills his promise to two different people. And both of these people respond to God fulfilling his promise. Episode 1, God and Abraham. Look at verse 1 of chapter 21 in Genesis. We read, now Yahweh, that's the Lord, visited Sarah as he had said, and Yahweh did for Sarah as he had promised. So Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the appointed time of which God had spoken to him. What is it that God did? God did something at this point in Abraham and Sarah's life. What did God do? Here's what God did. God visited Sarah. What does that mean? He did for Sarah. And so that means that Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age. Question: did God keep his promise? Well, of course he did. I want you to compare these two passages. Way back in Genesis 17, this is a year before, 1 year before. God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, I will bless her. And indeed, I will give you a son by her. My covenant I will establish with Isaac. You see, when God says, I will do something, you can take it to the bank. God will do it. We read in Genesis 21, Yahweh visited Sarah as he had said he would. Yahweh did for Sarah as he had promised. And not only did God keep his promise, but God kept his promise very particularly. God didn't mess up the details. Look at the timing. Back in Genesis 17, a year before, God said, at this season next year. When did it actually happen? Genesis 21. At the appointed time of which God had spoken. God kept his promise. And he kept his promise in all the little details. Well, now, as we know about promises, if there's a promise made and a promise fulfilled, then the receiver has to respond. And so Abraham and Sarah responded to the promise that God had fulfilled. How did they respond? They responded through obedience. How did they obey God? Well, first of all, they named the child Isaac. Abraham named his son Isaac. Look at Genesis 21, verses 3 and 4. We read, and Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. The very first thing that Abraham did was he named his son Isaac. Why Isaac? Because God told him to. Compare this verse again with chapter 17, verse 19. God said, Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. How did Abraham respond? Abraham responded by calling his name Isaac. Could have named him any name in the world, but he named him the one name that God said to name him, Isaac. He obeyed God a second way. How? By circumcising Isaac. Look at Genesis 17, verses 10 and 12. The Lord said, this is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and who? And your seed after you. That's your children. Every male among you shall be circumcised, and every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised. So what did Abraham do? Abraham obeyed God by circumcising his son Isaac. When? When he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Listen to me. If God gives you a command, and it's a very particular command, God wants you to obey him, and he wants you to obey him in a very particular way. For Abraham, it wasn't day 7. It wasn't day 9. It was day 8. Why? God said day 8. And so when God gives us a command, he wants us to obey his command very particularly. And so Abraham and Sarah responded to the promise that God had made by obeying God, by naming him Isaac, by circumcising him on the 8th day, and they also obeyed God by simply rejoicing in what God had done. They responded to God's promise being fulfilled by rejoicing. Look at verses 5 through 7. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. That makes Sarah 90, by the way. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. What does that mean? What's Isaac's name mean? The word Isaac means he laughs. There's a play on words here. And Sarah, you remember Sarah before, she was laughing sort of incredulously, like, I don't believe this is actually going to happen. Is God going to give me a child in my old age? Well, now it's happened. The one thing that should never happen has happened. And now she has a child in her old age, and she just finds it to be a point of rejoicing. God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. By the way, we laugh today when we read this story, when we consider the scope of this story. I would dare myself to go before a 90-year-old lady who is here in the congregation today and say, what if you had a child today? What would that be like? What are you doing? You're laughing. It's ridiculous. All throughout history, people hear this story, and today it is so beyond the scope of what's normal that we laugh. And so even today, by us laughing at even the concept, we are a part of what God has ordained. Isaac, he laughs. God has given laughter. He's made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. What a great question Sarah asked. She said, who would have said? Who would have thunk it? Who would have believed? Who came up with this idea? And the answer is only God. God is the one who came up with this idea. You see, God does things that no one else can even imagine. Let me give you an example. God gives a 90-year-old woman a son. God calls the younger son the firstborn. Who does that? Only God. God hardens Pharaoh's heart. Why? To set people free. To set his children free. God does things that no one else would even think of. God becomes one of us. Who would have thought of that? Only God. The king of the world, when he's born, he's put in an animal trough. And when he dies, we are saved. Who would have thought of that? Only God. And then by the hardening of Israel's hearts, the good news of the gospel goes to us Gentiles, who are not even a people. And yet now we are the people of God. And Scripture tells us by the salvation of the Gentiles, Israel, whose heart is hard, will be saved. Who would have thought of that plan? Only God. And in the end, every family of the earth will be blessed. Even the descendants of the Pharaoh whose heart God hardened, even his descendants will be blessed through God's fulfillment of his promise to Abraham 4 millennia ago. Who would have thunk it? Who would have believed that this 90-year-old woman and this 100-year-old man would have a son? What an incredible story. What an incredible response to God's fulfillment of his promise. Well, now we have another episode, because this little boy is going to start growing up. We have an episode between God and Hagar's son. And we read in verses 8 through 10, and the child grew. This is talking about Isaac. Isaac, the baby boy. The child grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing in jest. Therefore she said to Abraham, drive out this maidservant and her son. The son of this maidservant shall not be an heir with my son, with Isaac. Uh-oh. We got trouble in paradise. Blended families can be tough. Blended families can be real tough. I mean, it's not all Brady Bunch. You got a blended family, what happens? Each parent naturally defends his or her own child. And not only that, but every child naturally gravitates to his or her own parent. And then on top of that, when you got a blended family and the husband and the wife, they finally get the time together and the plan together, well, they can go out on a date. All right? And so they're going to take the wife's kids to her ex for the evening so they can go out on a date. But what you didn't know is that the ex-wife's mother, or the ex's mother, just went into the hospital. And so now all the plans have to be scrapped, and your date night is ruined. And you figure out pretty quickly, this is just one little scenario, but you figure out pretty quickly in a blended family that even though marriage is supposed to be two people, well, your family's a lot more than two people. In a blended family, you got the two of you, you got his kids, you got her kids, you got his parents, her parents, his ex, her ex, his ex's parents, and her ex's parents. Before you know it, there's 71 and a half people in your family. I mean, no wonder so many blended families struggle. No wonder how many blended families don't make it. They don't make it. It's possible to have a strong blended family. If that's the situation of life you find yourself in, let me tell you what you need to do is you need to get in touch with the Spirit of God and let His fruit become very real in your life. Because if you're in a blended family, or even just what we might say a standard family, you need love and peace, patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control, don't you? You need these things. So it can happen, but you need to rely on the Spirit of God. But what Abraham had, he had a whole nother level of blended family going on. Abraham didn't have too many kids. Abraham had too many wives. And so Abraham was about to go through a very difficult time. Here's Abraham. He wants to throw a feast. I mean, he's killed the fattened calf. They're going to bring everybody into the tent. One of these big old Bedouin tents, lay out the carpet, have a big feast there, and the guest of honor is the boy Isaac. Probably 2 years old, maybe 3 years old, the guest of honor. Why is he the guest of honor? He's growing up. He's weaned. What does that mean? Well, he's eating smushed carrots and green beans now. Okay? And this is a big deal. And so he's got his plate, and he's just shoving it all over his face like kids do, and he's just having a blast. And all of the servants are there to bless little Isaac. He's the guest of honor. And over in the corner, you got Ishmael, the big half-brother. Maybe about 16, 17 years old now. And he's mocking all of this. What a charade. He's deriding this. He's acting scornfully toward his younger sibling. Where did he get this attitude? From his mama. You remember Hagar? When Hagar got pregnant with Abraham, here's Hagar. She's still the maidservant of Sarah, but she goes up to Sarah and she mocks Sarah for being barren. Mocks her for something she really had no control of. Well, your husband didn't have any problem getting me pregnant. What's wrong with you? And this dug deep. This was a deep wound for Sarah. So here it is. A number of years later, Ishmael didn't pick up this bad attitude from any stranger. He mocks Isaac. Well, now Sarah has, as they say, had it. And Sarah knows the score of this game. Sarah's the one who speaks up, not Abraham. Why? I tend to believe that Abraham was, like most men, sort of clueless as to reading the room. Sarah could read the room. She knew the implications of Ishmael mocking Isaac. What do I mean? Well, Abraham at this point is probably minimum 102 years old. Sarah is 92. It's been known for people that age to die of old age. So what if Abraham and Sarah died? Do you think that big brother Ishmael is going to sit around for the better part of 2 decades while his little half-brother grows up and takes over the family business? No, I don't think so. I think Sarah knows he'll deal with Isaac his own way, and it would be rather violent. After all, Ishmael was predicted to be a wild donkey of a man. You see, the only thing protecting Abraham's lineage through Sarah is the fact that Abraham and Sarah haven't died yet, in spite of their age. And so Abraham has his wife, Sarah, come to him, and she says, "Get them out. I want them gone." Verses 11 through 13. And the matter distressed Abraham greatly because of his son, because of Ishmael. He was torn up. He was distressed. And so God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and your maidservant. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her voice, for through Isaac your seed shall be named. And of the son of the maidservant I will make a nation also, because he is your seed." Abraham was stressed out about this. Abraham didn't know what to do. He was distressed. And what did God say? God said, "Don't be." You know, sometimes in life, the circumstances of life can just get to be overwhelming. And sometimes we just need someone to come along and say, "Calm down. Take a breath." And so God tells Abraham, "Don't be distressed." You see, God knew something that Abraham didn't. God knew a lot of things that Abraham didn't. There's one thing in particular that Abraham didn't know was coming. But God did. God knew that there was a situation coming down the road for Abraham that's going to be a lot more distressing than this. You think that losing the son of your wife's maidservant is distressing? Wait till you're faced with losing the only son of your wife, the son that is supposed to be the fulfillment of God's promise. That's going to make this look like a walk in the park. And by the way, let me just tell you, if you're going through a distressing time right now, that's why you need to exercise faith. You need to trust in God. Have faith in God. Why? Because what's coming tomorrow might make you long for the problems of today to return. You don't know what's around the bend. You need to exercise those muscles of faith today so that you can be ready for tomorrow, come good or bad, rain or shine. And then God says to Abraham, "Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her voice." Now, wait a second. Way back in Genesis 3, you remember that? There's only, I think, about 2 people on the earth. There's Adam and there's Eve. And they get into a little problem, and God has a talk with Adam. And God says to Adam, "Because you listened to your wife, here are some curses for you." And then you fast forward to Genesis chapter 16. Abraham's minding his own business. Sarah, his wife, comes to him and says, "I got a great idea. Let's help God out. Here's Hagar, my maidservant. Have a child with her." And what happens? Well, Abraham ends up with 2 wives, a practically illegitimate son, and one of those wives, the first one, is extremely angry by the end of that story. What did Abraham do? It literally says he listened to his wife. But now, God says, listen to your wife. Listen to Sarah. Whatever she says, listen to her. What makes this difference? This time different? I mean, why should the man listen to his wife this time when it turned out so poorly the previous 2 times? Here's the difference. Because this time, Sarah and God agree. Sarah and God are on the same page. Gentlemen, when God and your wife agree, you better listen to your wife. This time, she and God are on the same page. Why do I need to listen to my wife if she and God agree? Because let me tell you something, men. You're not going to find 2 people who love you more than God and your wife. So when they're on the same page, you need to listen. Well, why is it true that Sarah and God are on the same page? Why is it necessary for Ishmael to be kicked out along with his mom? Well, Sarah's right. Only one of the 2, Ishmael or Isaac, will be Abraham's heir. Only one of the 2 is the child of promise. Only one of the 2 will receive the covenant that God made with Abraham. And the one that will is the younger. It is Isaac. Please notice that God still takes care of Ishmael. Verse 14. So Abraham rose early in the morning, and he took some bread and a skin of water. What's a skin of water? Well, you take a lamb, you empty it out, you wash it out, put water inside, you sew it up, and it's like a giant canteen, and you can strap it to your back. Took a skin of water, and he gave them to Hagar. And he put them on her shoulder, and he gave her the child and sent her away. And so she went and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba to the south. The wilderness basically means the desert. She and the boy are wandering around the desert. By the way, if you go back and you read this passage, every time, first of all, I'll just point out that Ishmael's name is never used. But when it's referring to Ishmael, in reference to his mother, the word child is used. Because no matter how old you get, you're always the baby boy to mama. And so she talks about her child. But when the boy Ishmael is used in reference to God, he uses a different term. Boy. This is a young man. Practically almost independent. He is a young man. And so they go off into the wilderness. Verse 15, when the water in the skin was finished, they got nothing left. Don't have water, you're going to die. She put the child under one of the bushes, and then she went and sat down opposite him about a bow shot away, maybe 100 yards away. For she said, do not let me see when the child dies. And she sat opposite of him and lifted up her voice and wept. Verse 17. Then God heard the voice of the boy crying. He was crying too. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what is the matter with you, Hagar? Do not fear, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Arise, lift up the boy, and hold him by the hand, for I will make a great nation of him. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew, And he lived in the wilderness and was an archer. And he lived in the wilderness of Paran. And his mother took a wife for him from where? Home. From the land of Egypt, where she was from. Took a wife for him. This separation between Isaac and Abraham and Sarah over here, and Ishmael and his mama Hagar over here, this separation creates a problem for you and me that may not be readily apparent. Here's the problem. I don't know about you, but I'm fairly certain that I'm not a descendant physically of Abraham and Isaac. Probably not one of Ishmael either. But the point is, only the descendants of Abraham through Isaac are the recipients of God's covenant. Only them. You and me, we're outside of this covenant that God made with Abraham. And there's nothing we can do about it. Why? Because it is birth that determines whether we're in the covenant or out of the covenant. And that's the bad news. The good news is this: God has made a new covenant. The new covenant is similar to Abraham's covenant. The new covenant is similar in that to be part of the new covenant, it's also a matter of your birth, but not your physical birth. It's a matter of a spiritual birth, a new birth. Jesus put it this way: you must be born again. And by the way, if through Jesus you become born again, then you know what the Bible calls you? You know what the New Testament calls you? It calls you a child of Abraham. Even though you might not be a physical descendant, you're a child of Abraham. Romans chapter 9 says, "For they are not all Israel who descended from Israel, nor are they all children because they are Abraham's seed. That is, the children of the flesh are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are considered as seed. For this is the word of promise: at this time I will come, and Sarah shall have a son." Children of the promise. Who are the children of promise? Galatians 4 answers that question. "And you, brothers, in accordance with Isaac, are children of promise." But what does the scripture say? "Cast out the servant woman and her son, for the son of the servant woman shall not be an heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brothers, we are not children of a servant woman, but of the free woman." Listen, today God wants to make a covenant with you, but you have to be willing to receive it. And God makes a promise. The promise is, in John chapter 6, "All that the Father gives me will come to me, and the one who comes to me I will never cast out." You know how Hagar and Ishmael were cast out? God says if you come to Jesus, He will never, ever cast you out. That's the promise that God makes to you. The question is, will you come to Jesus Christ the Lord? He died for you and He rose from the grave. He lives forevermore as Lord over all. And He is the fulfillment of the promise that God made to Abraham. So let me ask you a question. That promise that God made to Abraham way back in Genesis 12, all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. Who's the heir to that promise? Is it Isaac? I'd say yes, it's Isaac. But it's also you. You're the heir through faith in Jesus Christ.